Rome, in the year 121. A boy is born into a family of quiet standing on the Caelian hill, in a house that smells of olive oil and old stone. No one watching that morning could have known what the empire would ask of him. His name was Marcus. History would give him another name, later, when the weight of the world had settled onto his shoulders. But for now, he is only a child, sleeping, the way the city has slept and woken for 900 years. The family into which he was born, the Aurelius, were not the oldest blood in Rome, nor the richest. They had come, generations back, from a town in the south of Spain called Eucubi, a place of olive groves and red earth, far from the marble of the capital. But by the time of Marcus's birth, the family had risen. His grandfather had served as a consul 3 times over, an honor few men in the empire could claim even once. The house on the Caelian hill was large and calm, the kind of place where a child could wander from room to room and hear, faintly, the business of empire being conducted in low voices behind closed doors, without understanding a word of it. His father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, held the rank of praetor, a respectable office, a stepping stone toward higher things. But the boy would barely come to know him. He died while Marcus was still small, only a few years old, too young to hold on to more than fragments of memory. Later in his life, the man would write of his father only in the barest terms, a modesty and a manliness that he had been told about, rather than things he could recall firsthand. Grief, when it is early enough, does not always feel like grief. Sometimes it only feels like the shape of a room with one fewer person in it. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, did not remarry. This alone marked her as unusual among Roman women of her class, where widowhood was often brief, a pause before the next arrangement. She was wealthy in her own right, having inherited a fortune that included a large tile and brick works on the outskirts of the city, one of the great industries that kept Rome's endless construction supplied with the materials of empire. She raised her son largely alone, in a household that valued restraint over indulgence, simplicity over show. He would remember her, in the years that followed, for her piety, her generosity, and for something quieter still, an abstinence not only from evil deeds but even from evil thoughts. A mind, even at rest, could be trained. It was his grandfather, the elder Verus, who filled some of the space his father had left. A man 3 times consul, who had also served as prefect of the city, one of the most senior offices Rome could grant a private citizen. Under his roof, the boy absorbed something of what it meant to carry public duty without arrogance, to hold power the way one holds a heavy vase, carefully, aware at every moment of what could be broken. Rome itself, in these years, was near the height of its calm. The wars of conquest were long finished. The borders held, more or less, along their rivers and walls. It was later remembered, by those who lived through what came after, as a kind of high afternoon light, the empire large and settled and, for the most part, at peace. A child born into this Rome could reasonably expect a life of administration, of estates and offices, of the slow accumulation of honors that Roman aristocratic life offered to those born well and behaved correctly. Nothing about the child on the Caelian hill suggested, yet, that he would become anything more than that. a senator, perhaps, a consul, like his grandfather, a quiet name in a long list of names. But the house he grew up in had one particular kind of visitor that set it apart, if only slightly, from the houses of other well-born Roman boys. It was a house that took philosophy seriously, not as ornament, not as a subject for dinner conversation, but as something closer to a discipline of living. Even before he had a name for it, before he had read a page of Epictetus or heard the word Stoic spoken as anything more than a school of thought among many, the boy was being shaped by an atmosphere that treated self-control, plainness, and seriousness of purpose as virtues worth more than wealth or applause. He was given, as was customary for a boy of his station, a series of tutors. Grammar, first, then rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech that formed the backbone of a Roman public career. He showed an early aptitude for hard work, a willingness to sit with a problem longer than was asked of him. Later, one of his tutors would recall that even as a child, he preferred coarse clothing and a hard bed to the comforts available to him, that he had to be persuaded, gently, not to make himself into an ascetic before he had even become a man. It is a strange thing, a boy choosing discomfort when comfort is freely offered. But something in him seemed to sense, even then, that ease too easily given makes a person soft in places that will one day need to be strong. At around the age of 6, by the old Roman reckoning, he was enrolled among the equestrian order, a mark of favor that suggested the family's rising fortunes, and a sign that people in positions to notice such things had begun to notice him. And notice him they had. Because in the great house on the Palatine Hill, in the private chambers of the man who ruled the known world, the Emperor Hadrian himself had heard of this serious, hard-working, unusually earnest boy from the Caelian hill. Hadrian was, by this point in his reign, a man growing old, restless, brilliant, and increasingly consumed by the question that haunts every ruler who cannot produce an heir of his own body, who comes after me. He had travelled the length of the empire, from Britain to Egypt, inspecting walls and legions and temples with his own eyes, more than any emperor before him. He was a man who noticed things. And what he noticed in young Marcus was something he chose to name, half in jest, half in prophecy. He called the boy Verissimus, truest, a play on his family name, Verus, but also, it seems, a genuine observation. Even as a child, this one did not seem to lie, did not seem to perform sincerity the way so many at court learn to perform it. He simply seemed to mean what he said. It is a small thing, a nickname given by an aging emperor to a serious child. But nicknames, in the households of the powerful, are rarely only small things. They are early markings, chalk lines drawn around a person before that person has any say in the matter. Hadrian was already, by this time, turning over the question of succession in his mind, turning it over the way a man turns a coin, weighing its two faces against each other. He had no son. He would need to choose one. And somewhere in that long and careful calculation, a boy on the Caelian hill, not yet in his teenage years, had already been noticed, already been named, already been set gently apart from all the other well-born children of Rome, without knowing it, without being able to feel the weight of it yet. For now, though, he was simply a boy. He rose in the mornings in a quiet house. He studied his letters. He wrestled and rode, as Roman boys were expected to. He watched his mother move through her household with her particular and showy piety. He listened to his grandfather speak, in the evenings, of the offices he had held and the duties they had carried. And somewhere in the back rooms of their house, in the smell of wax tablets and lamp oil, a habit of mind was quietly forming, one that would, decades later, in a cold tent on a river at the edge of the known world, produce some of the most enduring words ever written by a person who never intended for them to be read by anyone at all. But that was still far away. For now, there was only a house on a hill, and a boy learning, slowly, what it meant to be still inside himself, long before the world would ask him to be still in front of it. By the middle of the year 136, the Emperor Hadrian was an old man in a hurry. He had ruled for nearly 2 decades, had walked the length of his empire more than any Caesar before him, and now, in failing health, he faced the one problem that all his roads and walls and legions could not solve for him. He had no son. The empire would need an heir, and Hadrian, characteristically, would choose that heir himself with his own judgment, rather than leave the matter to chance or to the Senate. His first choice was not the boy from the Caelian hill. It was a senator named Lucius Sionius Commodus, a man of pleasant manners and modest achievement, whom Hadrian adopted and renamed Lucius Aelius Caesar. It is not entirely clear, even now, why Hadrian settled on him. Perhaps it was affection. Perhaps it was a kind of relief, a wish to hand a burden to someone untroubled by it. Whatever the reason, the choice did not last. Aelius was already ill when he was adopted, and by January of the following year, he was dead, before he had ruled a single day, before the empire had learned to say his new name with any confidence. Hadrian, older now, sicker now, and running out of time in a way that must have felt increasingly physical, had to choose again. This time he chose more carefully, and with a kind of foresight that would shape the rest of the century. He settled on a senator named Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a man in his early 50s, wealthy, mild-tempered, respected on all sides, a man with no discernible enemies, which is itself a rare kind of achievement in Roman public life. But Hadrian's offer came with a condition, and the condition was the true center of the arrangement. Antoninus would be adopted as Hadrian's son and heir, yes, but Antoninus, in turn, would have to adopt 2 boys of his own. One was the young son of the dead Aelius, a child named Lucius, not yet 7 years old. The other was the serious, quiet 17-year-old from the Caelian hill, the one Hadrian had years earlier nicknamed Vericimus, Marcus. It was, in effect, a plan for 2 generations of succession decided in a single afternoon. Antoninus would rule next, as a caretaker, a steady hand for however many years the gods allowed him. And after Antoninus, the empire would pass to Marcus, with young Lucius somewhere beside or behind him, depending on how things unfolded. Hadrian had looked 20, 30 years into the future, and had tried to fix the succession in place the way a man braces a wall that is beginning to lean. The adoption took place on the 25th of February, in the year 138. On that day, the boy from the Caelian hill ceased, in the eyes of Roman law, to be the son of his own family, and became, instead, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, son of the man who would soon be emperor. He was not yet 17. Later tradition, not always reliable in its details but consistent in its shape, held that the news did not delight him, that when he was told what had been decided for him, what house he now belonged to, what future had been arranged around him without his voice in the matter, something in him resisted. That he would have preferred, if the choice had ever truly been his, to remain a private citizen, free to read and study and walk the same quiet rooms of the house he had grown up in, rather than to be measured, from that day forward, against the size of an empire. If this reluctance is true, and there is real reason to believe some version of it was, then it says something worth sitting with. Here was a life offered nearly everything a Roman could want: rank beyond any ancestor's rank, wealth beyond calculation, a name that would outlast the stones of the city. And the boy who received it seems to have felt, at least at first, less like a man handed a gift, and more like a man handed a weight he had not asked to carry, and could not now set down. Hadrian did not long survive his own arrangement. He died in July of that same year, at his villa near the coast, worn down by illness he had carried for some time. Antoninus became emperor, as planned, and the boy who had once been simply Marcus of the Anni Veri became something else now, something that would take him more than 2 decades to grow into. Not yet an emperor, not yet a philosopher, in any way the word would come to mean for him. Just an heir, a name attached, quietly and irrevocably, to the future of Rome, whether he had wanted it or not. The house he moved into now was grander than the one on the Caelian hill, but the habits that had been built there did not leave him. He kept his plainness. He kept his seriousness. And somewhere beneath the new title, the new toga, the new expectations settling onto him like dust after a long ride, the same quiet, watchful child was still there, still noticing everything, still waiting to understand what kind of man all of this was going to make of him. Rome, meanwhile, simply went on being Rome. The markets opened at dawn. The aqueducts carried their water down from the hills. The Senate met, argued, adjourned. None of it paused for the quiet reordering of one family's future that had just taken place in a private ceremony. Empires rarely announce the moments that will matter most. They only reveal them, slowly, years later, to those patient enough, or unlucky enough, to live long enough to see how the story ends. Antoninus Pius, as the Senate would soon call him, giving him a title that meant dutiful, took the throne of an empire already at peace, and he seemed determined, in a quiet, almost stubborn way, to keep it that way. He would rule for over 20 years, and in all that time, he would never once leave Italy.
No triumphal marches.
No great foreign campaigns carved into monuments. Just the long, patient work of administration, of hearing petitions, of settling disputes sent up from every province of a territory that stretched from the moors of northern Britain to the deserts beyond the Euphrates. It was not a glamorous kind of rule. It was, by most measures, a successful one. Marcus grew up inside this steadiness, and it left its mark on him. He watched an old man govern an empire not through conquest or spectacle, but through diligence, through the unglamorous daily labor of reading reports and weighing judgments fairly. It was, in its way, a second education, running alongside the more formal one of his tutors, an education in what power looked like when it was exercised without cruelty or vanity. His personal life, in these years, was being arranged around him with the same careful, dynastic precision that had brought him into this family in the first place. He had first been betrothed, as a boy, to a girl named Caeonia Fabia, the daughter of the ill-fated Aurelius Caesar, a match meant to bind the two adopted branches of Hadrian's plan together. But the engagement was quietly dissolved. Instead, Antoninus arranged for Marcus to marry his own daughter, a young woman named Faustina, Marcus's own first cousin, which was not considered unusual among Rome's ruling families, where marriages were less about romance and more about keeping power inside a small, trusted circle. The wedding would not take place for some years yet, but the arrangement itself tied Marcus even more tightly into the family that now held the empire. He was given real responsibility early and young. At 18, he held the office of quaestor, one of the first rungs on the ladder of Roman public service, responsible for financial administration. 2 years later, he was made consul, one of the two highest offices in the Roman state, a position his own grandfather had held 3 times, and which Marcus now held while barely into his 20s, an honor that under ordinary circumstances a man might spend decades of ambition trying to reach. But these were not ordinary circumstances. He was being groomed, deliberately and openly, and everyone in Rome understood exactly what they were watching. By the time he was 25, the Senate had granted him a share of the tribunician power, the same authority once used by figures like the Gracchi centuries earlier to claim to speak for the common people of Rome, and later folded into the powers that defined what an emperor actually was. In practice, this meant Marcus was no longer simply an heir waiting in the wings. He was, in most ways that mattered, already ruling alongside Antoninus, a kind of junior partner in an arrangement that would stretch on, patiently, for over 20 years. It was during these years that something else began to take shape in him, something less visible than his public offices, but in the end, more lasting. He had been trained since boyhood in rhetoric, the art of persuasive Roman speech, under a gifted and famous teacher named Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a man who loved Marcus with the kind of devotion that shows up, still, in the letters between them, discovered many centuries later and preserved by chance, letters full of warmth and worry over the younger man's health, his studies, his long absences. Fronto had hoped, quite naturally, that his brilliant student would become a great orator, perhaps the finest of his generation. But something else had begun to compete for Marcus's attention, something that pulled him away from the polished, performative art of rhetoric and toward a plainer, harder discipline. Philosophy, and in particular, the philosophy of the Stoics, the school that taught that a well-lived life depended not on eloquence or applause, but on virtue, on self-command, on seeing the world clearly and accepting what could not be changed. It would take him further from Fronto's hopes with each passing year, and it would take him, slowly, toward the version of himself that history would eventually remember. For now, though, he was simply the emperor's adopted son, moving through the rooms of power in Rome, holding titles that most men only dreamed of, and quietly, almost secretly, falling in love with an older, sterner kind of wisdom than the one his teachers had originally intended for him. There was a man named Junius Rusticus, a philosopher and statesman old enough to be Marcus's grandfather, whose household followed a strict and serious version of Stoic teaching, and who would come, in time, to matter more to Marcus than almost any other teacher he ever had. It was Rusticus who first placed into the young man's hands a copy of the discourses of a philosopher named Epictetus, a former slave from the eastern provinces who had taught, decades earlier, that freedom was not a matter of political rank but of what a person allowed to trouble their own mind. Marcus later credited this gift, this simple loan of a personal manuscript, as one of the turning points of his life. He remembered Rusticus not as a man who dazzled with clever argument, but as one who demonstrated, day to day, what a philosophic life actually looked like when it was lived rather than merely spoken about. This was a different kind of learning than what Fronto had offered him. Rhetoric was concerned with how a thing was said, with the shape and music of an argument, with moving an audience. Stoicism, as Marcus was coming to understand it, was concerned only with how a person lived, hour to hour, when no audience was watching at all. It asked harder questions. What can be controlled, and what cannot? What is worth wanting, and what only appears to be worth wanting? How a person ought to face pain, or loss, or the plain unfairness that life hands out without explanation. Other teachers reinforced this shift. Apollonius of Chalcedon arrived from the east with a reputation for exacting rigorous Stoic logic, a man reportedly so devoted to principle that he once refused to interrupt a lesson even when summoned by the emperor himself, insisting instead that the emperor come to him, since a teacher does not run to a student, wisdom does not run to power. Marcus, remarkably for a young man raised inside the imperial household, seems to have found this kind of stubborn integrity admirable rather than offensive. There was also Sextus of Chaeronea, a nephew of the great biographer Plutarch, whose calm, unhurried manner of teaching left its own quiet mark. Under this pressure, gentle but constant, Marcus began to live differently. He adopted a plainer style of dress than his rank required. He gave up the soft bedding available to him and slept, for a time, on the bare ground, or on an animal skin laid over it, a common ascetic practice among serious students of philosophy, meant to train the body to want less so that the mind could want more clearly. His mother, worried, eventually persuaded him to sleep on a couch spread with skins instead of the ground itself, a small compromise between the discipline he was chasing and the health his family wished him to preserve. It is a scene that echoes, faintly, the same instinct that had shown itself in him as a small child in the house on the Caelian hill, choosing hardness over comfort, as though some part of him understood early that comfort, taken too easily, has a way of hollowing a person out from the inside. None of this made him strange or isolated in the eyes of the court. If anything, it seems to have deepened the respect people already held for him. He was still dutiful in his public offices, still careful in his relationships, still, by every account, remarkably even-tempered for a young man given so much power so early. But underneath the offices and the titles, a different foundation was being laid, brick by careful brick. Not the foundation of a great orator, which is what his early teachers had once hoped for. The foundation of something quieter, and in the end, far more difficult to build. A mind trained to meet whatever came, disaster or triumph, with the same steady attention. He did not yet know what would be asked of that mind. No one training in those years, walking the calm streets of a Rome still resting in the long afternoon light of Antoninus's peace, could have guessed at the plague, the war, the losses waiting decades ahead. But the training was not wasted in the meantime. It rarely is. A discipline built in quiet years is simply a discipline waiting for the years that will not be quiet at all. that followed settled into a long, patient rhythm, the kind of rhythm that, looking back on it later, can feel almost like waiting, even though at the time it was simply living. Marcus married Faustina in the year 145, the cousin to whom he had long been promised, and the marriage, by most surviving accounts, appears to have been a genuinely close one, whatever complications later gossip and hostile biography would attach to her name. Children began to arrive, and kept arriving, over more than a decade. And here the record turns quietly sorrowful, in a way that was simply ordinary for the time, however painful it must have been to live through. Of the 13 or 14 children Faustina is believed to have borne him, only a handful survived into adulthood. Infancy and early childhood, in the Roman world, however wealthy the household, however skilled the physicians on call, remained a passage that a great many children did not complete. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment, rather than passing over it the way a list of dates tends to. A man widely remembered for his composure, for his discipline, for the careful management of his own inner life, spent these years burying child after child, again and again, while still holding public office, still receiving petitioners, still expected to appear day after day, as a picture of steadiness to a Roman public that had no patience for a magistrate's private grief. Whatever his philosophy gave him in these years, it was not an escape from sorrow. It was, at best, a way of carrying it without being destroyed by it. Alongside this private life, his public duties deepened steadily, without ever quite tipping over into the full weight of rule itself. He held a second consulship in the year 145, the same year as his marriage. He was granted, over time, an accumulating series of powers and honors that placed him, in practice, only a small step below Antoninus himself. Contemporaries describe him as extraordinarily attentive to the old emperor, more like a devoted student than a restless heir counting down the days until a throne became available. There is no strong evidence, in all the surviving record, of impatience on his part, no hint of a young man straining against an old man's long life. If anything, the relationship between them reads as unusually warm for a court where succession so often bred suspicion and rivalry. Antoninus, for his part, seems to have used these decades wisely, treating Marcus less as a figurehead in waiting and more as a genuine partner in governance, involving him in the daily business of hearing legal cases, reviewing provincial reports, weighing the endless small decisions that a functioning empire required. It was, in effect, the longest and most thorough apprenticeship any Roman emperor had ever received before taking the throne. By the time the crown eventually came to him, Marcus would not be stepping into an unfamiliar role. He would be stepping into a role he had already been quietly performing, in substance if not in name, for the better part of 2 decades. And so the years passed. Consulships, ceremonies, births, some of them followed too soon by small funerals. Long afternoons of philosophy, still pursued alongside the endless business of state. A city at peace, largely untroubled by the wars and plagues that would later come to define the second half of Marcus's life. A city that had no way of knowing how briefly this particular kind of calm would last, or how much would be asked, before long, of the quiet, disciplined man being so carefully prepared to inherit it. Antoninus Pius died on the 7th of March in the year 161 at his family estate outside Rome in the same unhurried, undramatic manner in which he had lived. Later tradition held that in his final hours, when a tribune came to ask him for the night's watchword, the old emperor gave him a single word to carry back to the guard: equanimity. Whether the story is precisely true or was simply the kind of story people wished to be true of a man who had governed so calmly for so long, it captured something real about him, and about the example he had spent 23 years quietly setting for the man who would now succeed him. The Senate wanted Marcus alone. He was, after all, the one who had been groomed for this moment since he was a teenager, the one who had already been governing in substance for years. But Marcus did something almost without precedent in Roman history. He insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius, the boy who had once been the son of the ill-fated Aurelius Caesar, be raised to share the throne with him, as an equal Augustus, rather than remain in a lesser rank that custom and convenience would have made easy to justify. It was, on its surface, a strange decision for a new emperor to divide his own authority the moment he received it. But it fit the man making it. Marcus seems to have regarded the arrangement Hadrian had made decades earlier, and the promise it implied, as a duty owed rather than a convenience to be quietly set aside now that he held all the power himself. The empire he inherited, jointly, did not grant him a gentle introduction. Almost immediately, the Tiber flooded its banks with unusual violence, drowning livestock, ruining grain stores, and triggering a famine that Marcus and Lucius had to manage in the very first months of a reign that had barely begun. Before the flooding had even fully receded, word arrived from the eastern frontier that Vologases IV, king of Parthia, Rome's oldest and most persistent rival, had invaded Roman territory in force, annihilating a legion and installing his own claimant on the throne of Armenia, a client kingdom Rome had long treated as its own. It fell to Lucius, the co-emperor, physically more robust and by most accounts less consumed by the daily discipline of administration than Marcus, to travel east and take nominal command of the war, while capable generals under him did the harder work of actually winning it. Marcus remained in Rome, managing the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of empire, the courts, the grain supply, the endless correspondence, while his brother's name was attached to a campaign being fought thousands of miles away. It was a sensible division of labor, and on its face, the arrangement appeared to work. Roman forces would eventually push deep into Parthian territory, sacking two of the enemy's great cities and forcing a settlement favorable to Rome. But victories, especially victories won far from home in unfamiliar climates, rarely come without cost, and this one carried a cost that no one in Rome could yet see coming, riding home quietly inside the very soldiers who had won it. For now, though, in these first anxious months of his reign, Marcus simply did what the moment required. He managed a flood. He managed a famine. He managed a war he had not chosen and could not personally see. 23 years of patient preparation were, at last, being spent. And whatever calm those years of Stoic discipline had built in him, they were about to be tested by something far larger than the loss of a child or the slow accumulation of civic duty. They were about to be tested by an empire beginning, slowly and almost invisibly, to come apart at its edges. . Parthian War ended, formally, in victory. Roman legions had marched deep into enemy territory, had burned the great cities of Seleucia and the Parthian royal capital at Ctesiphon, and had returned home to something that looked, on the surface, like triumph. Lucius Verus received the honours of conquest. Coins were struck. The frontier, for the moment, held. But an army marching home from a long campaign in the east carries more than its victories with it, and the legions returning from Parthia in the late 160s brought back something that no general had accounted for, something that could not be defeated by any tactic or fortification. A plague, likely smallpox, though the ancient sources are not precise enough for certainty, began spreading along the routes the soldiers travelled, through the crowded barracks and market towns of the empire, and eventually into Rome itself. It would come to be known, centuries later, as the Antonine Plague, and its true toll can never be fully known, though estimates by historians who have studied the surviving fragments of evidence run into the millions of dead across the following years and decades. Entire units of the army were left too weak to fight. Farms went unworked. Cities that had thrived under Antoninus's long peace began, for the first time in living memory, to feel the particular fear of a population that does not know how many of its neighbors will still be alive by spring. It could not have arrived at a worse moment, because at almost the same time, on the empire's northern frontier, the long quiet of the Danube border was ending. Germanic peoples, the Marcomanni, and their allies among the Quadi and other tribes pressed by movements further north and east that Rome could not see or control, began pushing across the river in numbers the frontier garrisons, thinned by plague and years of peacetime routine, could not hold back. By the year 170, the unthinkable had happened. Marcomannic warbands had broken through as far as northern Italy itself, laying siege to the city of Aquileia, the first time hostile forces had reached so deep into the Italian peninsula since Hannibal, more than 3 centuries before. For Marcus, a man trained since boyhood for administration and philosophy rather than for the field, this meant something almost no one, including perhaps Marcus himself, had ever expected of him. He would have to go to war, not as a distant name attached to a campaign managed by others, the way his brother Lucius had gone east, but personally, at the head of the legions, camped for years at a stretch along a cold northern frontier, in a war that would, in the end, occupy nearly the entire remainder of his reign. The treasury, drained by plague, war, and the ordinary costs of governing so vast a territory, could not easily bear the weight of a prolonged northern campaign. Rather than raise taxes on a population already reeling from disease and fear, Marcus made a choice that struck contemporaries as remarkable even at the time. He ordered the imperial palace's own treasures brought out and sold at public auction in the Forum of Trajan. Gold and silver plate, precious cups, even his wife's silk and jeweled garments, according to the sources that survive. 2 months the auction ran, the crowds of Rome walking past tables piled with the private wealth of the imperial household, buying pieces of it to fund a war on a frontier most of them would never see. It was, in its quiet way, a kind of philosophy made visible, without a word of explanation needed. A man who had spent his whole youth being taught that comfort was not owed to him, that discipline mattered more than display, now proving it in the plainest possible terms, by giving away the very trappings of the power he had inherited, rather than let the ordinary people beneath him carry a burden he could set down himself. The camp at Carnuntum sat on the southern bank of the Danube, a fortress town of timber and packed earth that had, for generations, marked the edge of the world Rome considered its own. Beyond the river lay forests the legions did not fully map, tribes whose names shifted and merged in Roman reports, a cold and unfamiliar country that offered a Roman emperor nothing of the marble and order he had grown up inside. It was here, and in outposts like it, that Marcus would spend a great many of the remaining years of his life, further from the city of his birth than any emperor of his family had ever chosen to be for so long. The days were filled with the business of war, a business Marcus had never trained for and by most accounts never grew to love. Troop movements. Supply lines strained further by the same plague still moving quietly through every camp and city it touched. Negotiations with tribal leaders who sometimes wanted peace and sometimes, having watched the empire weakened by disease, wanted considerably more than peace. It was slow, grinding, uncertain work, nothing like the clean triumphs recorded on the monuments back in Rome. But it is what happened in the quiet hours, after the day's business had ended, that history would come to value more than any battle fought in these years. Alone in his tent, by lamplight, Marcus began keeping a private notebook. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy rather than of Roman law or command, and he gave the collection no title beyond what later copyists would eventually attach to it, a simple Greek phrase that meant, roughly, things addressed to himself. He was not writing for the Senate. He was not writing for history, or for publication, or even, as far as any surviving evidence suggests, for a single other reader. He was writing the way a person might speak quietly to themselves in the dark, trying to talk their own mind back into order after a day that had tested it past its ordinary limits. The entries have no fixed shape. Some are only a sentence or two. Others run longer, working through the same handful of ideas from slightly different angles, as though he were turning a stone over in his hand, looking for the side that would finally catch the light correctly. He returned, again and again, to a small cluster of concerns. How briefly a human life lasts, set against the vast unbothered turning of the world. How little of what people chase, reputation, wealth, the good opinion of strangers, actually deserves the weight given to it. How every living thing, city, empire, or single soldier freezing on watch along the Danube belongs to a single, larger, connected order of nature and owes something to the rest of it in return. He was not inventing these ideas from nothing. Much of what fills those private pages draws on the Stoic teaching he had absorbed decades earlier, from Rusticus, from the borrowed words of Epictetus, from teachers whose names would otherwise have vanished into the ordinary forgetting that swallows most tutors of most students. But there is a difference between learning an idea as a young man in a peaceful, comfortable Rome and needing that same idea urgently, as an older man surrounded by the sick and the dying, uncertain whether the next season's fighting would be the one that finally ended in. No one reading over his shoulder in that tent could have guessed that these private, unpolished lines, written for an audience of one, in the coldest, hardest years of his life, would eventually outlast the empire itself, would be read centuries later by people living in countries that did not yet exist, speaking languages that had not yet been born, still searching, the way he had searched by lamplight on the Danube, for some way to meet an uncertain life without being broken by it. The plague did not relent, and it did not discriminate. It moved through the crowded barracks of the frontier armies and through the crowded tenements of Rome with the same indifference, and by the time its worst years had passed, the historians who later tried to estimate its cost could only really agree that the number was enormous, and that no part of the empire, however wealthy or however remote, had been entirely spared. Some ancient sources describe carts required simply to carry away the dead from the city, more bodies than the ordinary rites of burial could keep pace with. It was in the midst of this, in the year 169, that Marcus lost the man who had shared his throne for 8 years. Lucius Verus, traveling with Marcus back toward Rome after another season on the northern frontier, fell suddenly and severely ill, and died within days, most likely from a stroke, though the precise cause remains uncertain across the centuries. Marcus, present for his brother's final hours, carried the body back to Rome himself, and saw to a funeral and a formal deification befitting the man he had once insisted, against easy alternatives, on sharing his rule with. Whatever tension or rivalry might have existed between two men holding equal power, the record that survives suggests something closer to genuine grief. Marcus was, from that point forward, sole emperor of Rome, a position he had once quietly declined to hold alone. Now he's without any way to hand part of it back. The losses did not stop there. Across these same difficult years, Marcus continued to bury children, as he had all his adult life, the particular cruelty of the ancient world's mortality showing no more mercy to an emperor's household than to any other. His own health, never especially robust, began to trouble him more seriously as well. His personal physician, a brilliant and famously self-assured Greek doctor named Caelian, who had come to Rome some years earlier and eventually attached himself to the imperial household, left behind detailed accounts of treating Marcus for chronic stomach and chest complaints, describing a patient who worked through pain and illness as a matter of course, rarely complaining, rarely allowing his discomfort to interrupt the business of the day. Caelian's own writings, remarkably, survive in far greater volume than almost any other ancient physicians, and they give us one of the closest surviving views of Marcus not as an emperor or a philosopher, but simply as a tired, aging, unwell man, trying to keep functioning under a weight that would have broken most people considerably younger and considerably less burdened. It would be easy, looking back from a great distance, to describe these years only in terms of dates and casualty estimates, the dry accounting that history so often reduces a period of suffering into. But it is worth remembering what it must have actually felt like to live through, for the man at the center of it especially. Year after year of disease moving invisibly through his cities. A war on the frontier that would not end. The deaths of children, one after another, across 2 decades. The death, finally, of the one man who had shared the crown with him and understood, better than anyone else alive, exactly what the weight of it felt like. 14 centuries after Marcus's death, his private notebook survived only by a kind of quiet, improbable luck, passed hand to hand through a chain of copyists and monasteries whose names we mostly do not know, in a transmission so narrow that scholars still are not entirely certain how close any surviving copy comes to the words he actually wrote in that tent by the Danube. The first printed edition did not appear until the year 1559, published in Zurich by a scholar named Wilhelm Zeilander, working from a manuscript that has since been lost entirely, meaning that the very foundation of the text as we now know it rests on a document no living person has seen in centuries. There is a particular kind of irony in this, one worth sitting with quietly for a moment. A man wrote these pages with, as far as any evidence suggests, absolutely no intention that another human being would ever read them. He was not composing philosophy for students, the way a teacher might. He was not writing memoirs for the historical record, the way other emperors sometimes did, shaping their own legacy in advance. He was simply talking to himself in the only language, Greek, that his deepest education had trained him to think in, trying to hold his own mind together during the hardest years of a life that had asked more of him than almost any Roman before him. And yet it is precisely that private, unpolished, unintended quality that has made the work endure the way it has. The themes that return again and again through its pages are not complicated. They are the same handful of ideas, turned over from a dozen different angles across a dozen different difficult days. That a human life is a small and brief thing, set against the vastness of time, and that almost nothing gained through status or applause is worth the anxious effort spent chasing it. That people, however frustrating or unjust, are bound together in a single natural order, obligated to treat one another with a kind of patient fairness regardless of how badly any one of them behaves. That death is not an enemy sneaking up on a person from outside life, but simply one more ordinary process of a nature that is constantly changing every single thing it touches, the same nature that turns a season, or a river, or a young soldier's face weathered slowly by years of northern winters. He returns, more than once, to a mental exercise that later readers would come to call the view from above, imagining himself lifted far enough into the sky to see the whole curve of the earth beneath him, all its wars and marketplaces and grieving households reduced to the scale of a single crowded anthill, in order to remember, freshly, how small any one man's private anxieties actually are, set against so vast a stage. It is not a comforting trick in the softer, modern sense of comfort. It offers no promise that the pain will stop, or that the losses will make sense. It only offers perspective, the plain reminder that this moment, however unbearable it feels while inside it, is one small moment inside something enormous and ongoing, something that was here before him and would continue on, unbothered, long after he was gone. That was enough for him, apparently, most nights. It has been enough, in the centuries since, for a great many people who never knew his name meant truest, who never knew about the house on the Caelian hill, who only ever encountered him as a quiet voice on a page, speaking to no one in particular, and somehow, across all that distance, still managing to be heard. The final campaign season began the way so many of the others had, with Marcus once again on the frontier, once again away from Rome, once again managing a war against the same tribes along the same difficult river that had occupied so much of the last decade of his life. He was 58 years old now, and the physical toll of nearly constant campaigning, combined with the chronic illness Galen had spent years treating, had worn him down in ways that were becoming harder to disguise, even for a man so practiced at disguising discomfort from the people around him. The ancient sources place his final days at Sirmium, along the Roman military road system in what is now Serbia, though popular memory, helped along many centuries later by films and novels that found the story too good not to relocate, has often imagined his death instead at Vindobona, the frontier post that would eventually grow into the city of Vienna. The historians themselves are not entirely certain which is correct, one of the small, humbling reminders that even a life this thoroughly documented still slips, at its most important moments, into some degree of honest uncertainty. Wherever the precise location, the outcome was the same. On the 17th of March, in the year 180, Marcus Aurelius died, in a military camp, far from the house on the Caelian hill where his story had begun nearly 6 decades earlier, far from the calm, settled Rome of Antoninus's long peace that he had spent his whole boyhood absorbing. He died, in the end, much as he had lived through most of his reign, at war, at a distance, doing work that had never been the work he would have chosen for himself if the choice had ever truly been his to make. The throne passed to his son, Commodus, the one child among more than a dozen who had survived to stand beside his father as a young man and inherit what he left behind. It was, in its own quiet way, a break from everything that had come before. For 4 successive emperors, going back through Antoninus, through Hadrian, through Trajan, through Nerva, Rome had been ruled by men chosen through adoption, capable outsiders selected for the qualities the role demanded rather than for an accident of birth. Marcus was the first in that long chain to have a surviving son of his own to hand the empire to, and he chose, in the end, to hand it to that son, rather than continue the pattern that had served Rome so well for nearly a century. Historians looking back across the centuries, most famously an 18th century Englishman named Edward Gibbon, would come to treat this single decision, quiet and understandable and deeply human as it was, as the hinge on which a long, stable peace finally began to turn toward a harder and more troubled age. But that judgment belonged to the future, and Marcus, in his final winter, could not have known how the story would eventually be told. What he left behind was not only an heir, and not only the borders he had spent nearly 2 decades of his life defending, often at enormous personal cost. He left behind, quietly, almost by accident, a private notebook that no one was ever meant to read, and somewhere in the city he had governed for so long, a bronze statue would eventually stand, an emperor on horseback, arm raised, gazing out over a public square. It is the only bronze equestrian statue of a Roman emperor to survive from antiquity into the present day, spared centuries of melting and reuse only because medieval Rome mistakenly believed it depicted a different emperor entirely, one whose memory the church had reason to protect. So the horse and rider stood, quietly misremembered, through all the centuries that swallowed nearly every other bronze likeness of every other Roman emperor who had ever lived. And the private notebook survived too, by its own separate and equally improbable path, until both, statue and pages, arrived here, into whatever room you are lying in now, still carrying, across 18 centuries, the same quiet, watchful attention that had once belonged to a serious child in a house on a hill, who never asked for any of this, and met it anyway, one difficult day after another, for as long as he was given. The rain continues outside, the way it has continued outside for as long as there have been walls to hear it against. Rest now. There is nothing more the story needs from you tonight.